There are places in this world where daylight never truly reaches. Places built of cold steel, reinforced concrete, and the broken remnants of human souls. In the heart of the state penitentiary, the air is always heavy with impending violence. Here, survival is a daily struggle, and weakness is punished without mercy. But sometimes, the most dangerous man in the room is not the one covered in tattoos. Sometimes, true strength comes wrapped in the wrinkled skin of an old man who has nothing left to lose. This is a story of a father's love, a corrupted system, and a brutal kind of justice. Arthur Pendleton was a man of the forest. For over 40 years, he had worked as a park ranger in the remote expanses of the Blue Ridge Mountains. He knew the calls of the wild, the changing of the seasons, and the quiet peace of isolation. He was not a criminal. He was a grandfather who had spent his entire life protecting the innocent, but the justice system is rarely fair. When the wealthy and powerful decide to crush you, the truth often gets buried under piles of dirty money. Arthur found himself dragged from his peaceful mountain cabin and thrown into a maximum security nightmare. His crime was simple. He had protected his family, and for that, a powerful district attorney had sworn to make his final years a living hell. The harsh fluorescent lights flickered above, casting long, distorted shadows against the peeling paint of the prison walls. Arthur walked slowly down the endless concrete corridor. His old joints ached with every heavy step. He was carrying a terribly thin mattress under his arm. The fabric was stained, and the cotton inside had clumped together into hard, uncomfortable ridges. In his other hand, he held a small plastic bag containing his only permitted possessions. Despite the grim surroundings, Arthur kept his back as straight as his 70 years would allow. He was a man who had spent decades walking through brutal winter storms and dense mountain forests. A dark hallway was not going to break his spirit. The air in the corridor smelled heavily of bleach, stale sweat, and sheer desperation. Behind the heavy iron doors on either side, he could hear the muffled sounds of shouting, metal clanking, and the restless pacing of caged men. The young corrections officer walking behind him kept a steady pace. The guard nervously adjusted his heavy duty belt. Arthur did not complain. He understood the reality of his situation. He had broken the law, and now he was walking into the belly of the beast to pay his debt. The sounds of his scuffed boots echoed loudly, marking a steady rhythm toward his new and terrifying reality. The young guard glanced around nervously to ensure no one else was listening. He stepped a little closer to the old ranger. His voice dropped to a barely audible whisper over the constant hum of the prison ventilation system. He told Arthur that if anyone tried to hurt him or mess with his things, he should just call out. The guard promised to help him however he could. Arthur stopped for a brief moment and turned his head. A small, genuine smile touched the corners of his weathered lips. He looked deeply into the young man's eyes and gently shook his head. He thanked the officer for his kindness, but Arthur stated clearly that he had dug this grave himself, and now it was his absolute responsibility to lie in it. The guard looked incredibly surprised by this calm acceptance. He was used to inmates begging for protection, making excuses, or crying about their innocence. He shrugged his broad shoulders and motioned for Arthur to keep moving. They finally reached the very end of the cell block. This was the worst section of the entire penitentiary. It was placed far away from the main observation desk. The isolation here was heavy and intentional. Arthur realized immediately that the vindictive district attorney had orchestrated this exact placement. The corrupt official wanted the old man to suffer in the darkest, most dangerous corner available. The guard commanded the elderly prisoner to halt and face the cold cinder block wall. A heavy ring of brass keys jingled loudly in the suffocating silence of the corridor. The officer found the correct key and shoved it into the massive iron door. He told Arthur to step inside, adding a harsh comment about this being his new home for the next few years. The guard offered a heavy slap on Arthur's frail shoulder before pulling the heavy door open. The metallic groan of the hinges sounded like a beast waking from a deep slumber. Arthur stepped over the worn threshold. The door slammed violently shut behind him with an echoing boom. The heavy deadbolt slid into place with a terrifying finality. Instantly, an overwhelming wave of heat and horrible odours hit Arthur directly in the face. The smell of unwashed bodies, cheap tobacco, and open plumbing was incredibly strong. The sudden shift in atmosphere made the old man dizzy. He leaned his tired shoulder against the rough concrete wall just to keep his balance. The cell was dimly lit by a single dirty bulb caged in wire mesh on the high ceiling. It took several long seconds for Arthur's eyes to adjust to the oppressive gloom. He commanded his lungs to breathe slowly. He forced his racing heart to calm down. He knew that showing fear in a room full of predators was a fatal mistake. Arthur slowly straightened his posture. He had spent his entire life in the deep woods. He had faced down angry bears and desperate poachers on narrow mountain trails. He refused to let a room full of lost men intimidate him now. He cleared his throat and spoke loudly into the dim room. He offered a simple, polite greeting to the men inside. He knew he had to establish some kind of presence immediately. At first, the only response was a low, threatening murmur. It felt as if the old man was invisible, a ghost standing in a graveyard of the living. Shadows shifted on the metal bunks. The cell was severely overcrowded. Men were crammed into every available space. Arthur scanned the room, looking for an empty spot to drop his terrible mattress. Before he could take another step, a harsh, gravelly voice cut through the heavy air. The voice came from the darkest corner of the cell. It dripped with authority and cruel amusement. The voice demanded to know why the old man was standing there like a useless statue. Arthur tightened his jaw. He squinted into the shadows and calmly replied that he was simply looking for a place to sleep. A large, heavily muscled man pushed his way out of the darkness. He walked toward Arthur with the deliberate, terrifying grace of an apex predator closing in on its prey. The aggressive stranger stood completely shirtless in the sweltering heat of the crowded cell. His chest and arms were completely covered in aggressive, dark prison tattoos. To Arthur, these ink marks meant absolutely nothing, but to everyone else in the room, they signaled extreme danger. The man introduced himself as Jackson. He smiled a twisted, wicked smile that did not reach his cold, dead eyes. Jackson pointed a thick, scarred finger toward the absolute worst spot in the entire room. He told the old man that he would be sleeping right next to the open, foul-smelling toilet. Jackson called it the trash corner, a place reserved strictly for the weakest and most despised inmates. Arthur felt his stomach drop. He realized immediately that this was a deliberate test of his dignity. The other prisoners erupted into cruel, mocking laughter. They nodded in agreement, eager to see the new arrival completely humiliated by the cell boss. These hardened criminals could not imagine that this quiet old ranger had a spine made of solid steel. Jackson stepped dangerously close to Arthur. He whispered a horrific threat directly into the old man's ear. He promised to break Arthur's ribs if he dared to speak back. He stated clearly that Arthur belonged with the absolute worst filth of the prison. Arthur stared at the designated spot. The stench was unbearable. He knew if he accepted that spot, his life in this cell would be endless torture. Arthur clutched his small bag, preparing himself for a physical confrontation he knew he could not possibly win. Just as he took a reluctant step forward, a sudden movement caught his eye. A tall, athletic young man leaped gracefully down from the top bunk. The young man landed solidly on his feet and immediately stepped right in front of Arthur. He placed a strong, protective hand on the old ranger's shoulder and pushed him gently backward. The young man turned his fierce gaze directly onto Jackson. His name was Leo. Leo demanded to know why Jackson was treating an old man with such extreme disrespect. He challenged the cell boss openly, asking what crime the old man had committed to deserve the worst punishment. The entire cell went completely silent. The tension in the air became thick enough to cut with a knife. Jackson's face twisted into an expression of pure, unadulterated rage. He glared at Leo, his fists clenching tightly at his sides. Leo was young, strong, and clearly capable of doing massive damage in a real fight. Jackson knew that an all-out brawl with Leo could jeopardize his absolute control over the cell. Instead of throwing a punch, Jackson resorted to psychological warfare. He sneered and told Leo to mind his own business. He assumed loudly that Arthur was just a pathetic, weak old man who probably stole vegetables from a grocery store. Jackson demanded that the old man speak for himself and confess his pathetic crimes to the group. Jackson paced back and forth, mocking Arthur with every step. He decided to escalate his verbal assault. He looked at Arthur with absolute disgust and asked if the old man was actually a predator. Jackson suggested loudly that Arthur must have touched someone he shouldn't have, implying the worst possible crime an old man could commit. In prison culture, men who harm children or women are treated with extreme, violent prejudice. By making this accusation, Jackson was giving the entire cell permission to destroy Arthur. The inmates began to mutter angrily. The mood in the room shifted from cruel amusement to dangerous hostility. Men started sitting up on their bunks, staring at Arthur with cold, murderous intent. Jackson smiled triumphantly, rubbing his heavily tattooed hands together. He believed he had successfully condemned the old ranger to a slow, painful death behind bars. Leo stood his ground, but even he looked back at Arthur with a flicker of hesitation. The young man needed to know the truth before he risked his own life in a bloody fight. Arthur felt the heat rushing to his face. A deep, righteous anger began to burn in his chest. He stood up perfectly straight. He looked directly into Jackson's eyes without blinking. He prepared to tell the absolute truth, knowing that his words would determine whether he survived the next 5 minutes in this concrete box. Arthur took a deep breath. His voice rang out clear, deep, and steady, cutting through the toxic atmosphere of the cell. He looked at Jackson and stated that he was not a predator. He declared loudly that he was sitting in this prison for attempted murder. Arthur explained that he had hunted down the district attorney's son and his 2 wealthy friends. He told the room exactly how he had levelled his double-barrel shotgun at the arrogant rich kids. He confessed that at the very last second, he decided they did not deserve a quick death. Instead, he had loaded his weapon with rock salt and heavy birdshot. He blasted all 3 of them from a close distance, ensuring they would suffer agonizing, humiliating pain without actually dying. Arthur described the satisfying sound of the shotgun roaring in the night and the pathetic screams of the rich boys falling to the pavement. The words hung in the stale air for a long, shocking moment. The violent criminal stared at the grey-haired ranger in absolute disbelief. The idea of an old man walking up to the most powerful family in the city and blasting them with a shotgun was completely unthinkable. The silence was heavy and profound. Arthur kept his chin high, showing absolutely no remorse for what he had done. He was ready to fight the entire room if he had to. Suddenly, a single prisoner in the back started to laugh. It was not a mocking laugh, but a laugh of pure, genuine respect. Soon another inmate joined in, and then another. Within seconds, the entire cell erupted into thunderous applause and loud cheering. The hardened thieves, drug dealers, and brawlers pushed past Jackson to get closer to Arthur. They patted the old ranger firmly on his back and shook his calloused hands. Every man in that room hated the corrupt district attorney. Hearing that this old man had taken a shotgun to the prosecutor's spoiled son was the greatest story they had heard in years. The respect for Arthur was immediate and absolute. Jackson stood frozen in his dark corner. His face was pale with furious humiliation. He realized that his plan to break the old man had backfired spectacularly. Arthur was now treated as a hero among the inmates. Leo smiled warmly and helped Arthur carry his thin mattress to a comfortable, clean bunk near the window. Leo introduced himself properly, shaking Arthur's hand with immense respect. As Arthur finally sat down on his new bed, he caught Jackson staring at him from the shadows. The cell boss's eyes were filled with venomous hatred. Arthur knew that the danger was far from over, but for tonight he had won his right to exist. Later that night, the prison cell finally quieted down. The only sounds were the heavy breathing of sleeping men and the distant metallic clanks of the security gates. Arthur lay on his thin mattress, staring up at the cracked ceiling. His mind began to drift far away from the concrete walls. He closed his eyes and vividly remembered the dense pine forest of his youth. He thought of the Blue Ridge Mountains, where the morning mist hung heavy over the vibrant green valleys. It was in those very mountains that he had built his entire life. He had returned from military service as a young, ambitious man, with a simple dream of living among the trees. He remembered the exact moment he first saw his late wife, Eleanor. She was standing outside a small country store, the wind blowing her bright auburn hair across her smiling face. He had courted her with nervous determination. When she finally agreed to marry him, he felt like the richest man on earth. Together, they had built a beautiful, sturdy wooden cabin right on the edge of the deep forest. Their early years together were filled with quiet joy, hard work, and endless love. Arthur smiled in the dark, letting the beautiful memory wash over the cold reality of his prison cell. But the memory soon turned dark and painful. Arthur shifted uncomfortably on his bunk as the old trauma resurfaced. He remembered the fierce, terrible storm that raged on the night Eleanor went into labour. The rain was coming down, in blinding sheets, turning the mountain dirt roads into dangerous rivers of mud. Arthur had driven his old truck recklessly through the darkness, desperate to reach the small rural hospital. He remembered carrying his agonising wife through the bright hospital doors. The doctors had looked worried from the very start. The baby was positioned wrong. The small hospital simply did not have the equipment or the specialist to handle the severe complication. Arthur had paced the waiting room floor for agonising hours. His boots left muddy tracks on the clean white tiles. Finally, the exhausted doctor emerged. The look of absolute defeat in the doctor's eyes shattered Arthur's world instantly. Eleanor had suffered massive internal bleeding. They could not save her. Arthur remembered sitting on a cold metal bench outside the hospital, crying uncontrollably as the rain washed over him. In a single devastating night, he had become a father to a beautiful baby girl and a grieving widower. He named his daughter Sarah, wrapping her tightly in his large, shaking arms, promising to protect her forever. Raising a child entirely alone in the remote wilderness was the hardest challenge Arthur ever faced. He learned to cook, to braid hair, and to mend torn dresses. He took little Sarah with him on his long ranger patrols. He taught her the names of the birds, how to track deer, and how to find safe drinking water in the wild. For the first 10 years, they were completely inseparable. But as Sarah grew into a teenager, the quiet mountain life began to suffocate her. She started reading glossy magazines and watching television shows about glamorous city lives. She hated the isolation. She hated wearing old clothes and taking a long, bumpy bus ride to the local school. The small cabin, once filled with laughter, became a battleground of constant arguments. Sarah blamed Arthur for their poverty. She screamed that he was keeping her trapped in the middle of nowhere. Arthur tried his best to provide, taking extra shifts and saving every spare dollar in a rusted tin can hidden under the floorboards. But nothing he did was ever enough to satisfy her growing resentment. He watched helplessly as the sweet little girl he had raised turned into an angry, bitter stranger who desperately wanted to escape her roots. The day Sarah finally left broke Arthur's heart into a million irreparable pieces. It was a dusty, terribly hot summer afternoon. Sarah had packed a single battered suitcase. She refused to look Arthur in the eye as she marched down the dirt road toward the highway bus stop. Arthur ran after her, his heart pounding heavily in his chest. He begged her to stay, to finish her schooling, to think about the dangers of the big city. But Sarah was incredibly stubborn. She coldly told him that she would rather starve in a city than rot in the forest. Seeing that he could not stop her, Arthur reached into his pocket. He pulled out the thick envelope of cash he had been saving for years. It was supposed to be her college or wedding fund. He pressed the money into her reluctant hands. He choked back his tears and told her that he loved her, no matter what. Sarah snatched the money, gave him a brief, emotionless nod, and climbed onto the loud, smoking bus. Arthur stood completely alone by the side of the road in a cloud of exhaust dust. He watched the bus disappear around the mountain bend. He returned to his empty cabin. The silence inside the wooden walls was absolutely deafening. He waited endlessly for letters or phone calls that almost never came. 7 long, lonely years passed. Arthur aged significantly, his hair turning completely silver. He spent his days patrolling the woods and his nights sitting by the fireplace, looking at old photographs. Then, one late autumn evening, a rusty car pulled up to the cabin. Sarah stepped out. She looked entirely different. Her face was gaunt, her eyes had dark, exhausted circles under them, and her clothes were completely worn out. The harsh city life had clearly chewed her up and spit her out. But she was not alone. Hiding nervously behind her thin legs was a beautiful little girl, no more than 5 years old. The girl had Eleanor's bright, intelligent eyes. Sarah offered a brief, awkward hug. She spoke fast, nervously explaining that her life was a total mess. She claimed she was moving overseas with a new boyfriend to start a business. She said the environment was too unstable for a child. With chilling detachment, Sarah asked Arthur if he could take the little girl, Maya, just for a year or two. Arthur looked down at the terrified child. His heart swelled with immediate, overwhelming love. He agreed, without a single second of hesitation. He picked little Maya up, holding her close to his chest. The next morning, Sarah was gone before the sun even rose. She never came back. Raising Maya was completely different from raising her mother. It was as if the universe had given Arthur a second chance to experience the pure joy of parenthood. Maya was a bright, curious, and incredibly deeply empathetic child. She did not crave loud cities or expensive toys. She loved the forest just as much as Arthur did. She followed him everywhere, her little boots stepping carefully in his large footprints. They spent countless hours fishing in the clear mountain streams, identifying different constellations in the night sky, and reading thick books by the warm fire. Maya brought absolute light back into the old ranger's lonely life. The cabin was filled with genuine laughter once again. Arthur taught her the importance of kindness, the value of hard work, and the absolute necessity of standing up for what is right. He poured every ounce of his love and wisdom into his granddaughter. In return, Maya looked at Arthur as her absolute hero. She excelled in her local school, bringing home top grades and making Arthur incredibly proud. The pain of Sarah's abandonment slowly faded into the background. Arthur felt a deep, comforting sense of peace. He believed that the terrible storms of his life had finally passed, leaving only calm waters ahead. As Maya grew into a beautiful, intelligent young woman, she discovered a deep passion for helping others. When she turned 18, she decided she wanted to become a registered nurse. The only nursing program available was located in a large city several towns away. Arthur offered to sell his beloved cabin to move closer to the city, but Maya absolutely refused to let him sacrifice his home. Instead, she decided to commute. Every morning, long before the sun peeked over the mountains, Maya walked down to the main highway to catch a ride or take the early bus. It was a grueling, exhausting schedule, but Maya tackled it with incredible determination. Arthur worried constantly. He hated the idea of his precious granddaughter standing alone on the foggy highway. He bought her a heavy coat and a small can of pepper spray, making her promise to be incredibly careful. For months, the routine worked perfectly. Maya was at the top of her nursing class, and Arthur was saving money to buy her a reliable used car. They were happy, but tragedy, Arthur learned, does not announce its arrival. It waits patiently in the shadows, choosing the exact moment when you feel the most secure. It happened on a miserably cold, rainy Tuesday afternoon. Maya had missed the last rural bus due to a late clinical exam. She stood shivering on the side of the wet highway, holding her heavy textbooks against her chest. The rain was soaking completely through her coat. Several cars splashed past her, ignoring her desperate attempts to hitch a ride. Just as she was beginning to lose hope, a sleek, extremely expensive black SUV pulled over onto the gravel shoulder. The tinted window rolled down smoothly. Behind the steering wheel sat Bradley Sterling, a handsome, well-dressed young man in his early 20s. He offered her a warm, charming smile. Two of his friends sat in the back, laughing at some private joke. Bradley politely offered Maya a ride, noting how terrible the weather was. Maya hesitated. Her instincts told her to wait, but the freezing rain was becoming unbearable, and she desperately needed to get home to Arthur. The vehicle looked safe, and the young men looked like wealthy college students. Taking a deep breath, Maya opened the heavy door and climbed into the warm, leather-scented interior. She thanked them profusely. She had absolutely no idea that she had just stepped willingly into a rolling nightmare. The drive started normally enough. Bradley talked smoothly about his college classes and his wealthy family. But after a few miles, he completely bypassed the turnoff for Maya's mountain road. Maya noticed immediately and pointed out the mistake. The boys in the back stopped laughing. A terrifying, heavy silence filled the expensive SUV. Bradley's charming smile twisted into a cold, cruel sneer. He locked the doors with a sharp electronic click. He turned the vehicle onto an abandoned, deeply wooded logging trail. Maya panicked. She screamed and pulled desperately at the door handle, but it was useless. The vehicle plunged deep into the dark, isolated woods. When the SUV finally stopped, the true horror began. The three privileged young men dragged Maya out into the freezing mud. They were completely merciless. They operated with the terrifying confidence of boys who had never faced a single consequence in their entire lives. They stripped her of her dignity, her safety, and her peace. When they were finally finished, they left her shivering and bleeding in the dirt. Bradley leaned out of his warm car and delivered a chilling final threat. He told her his father was the district attorney. He promised that if she told the police, his father would destroy her and her grandfather completely. Then they drove away, leaving her to die. It took Maya hours to crawl back to the main road and walk the excruciating miles back to the cabin. It was well past midnight when Arthur heard a weak, desperate scratch at the wooden front door. When he opened it, his entire world collapsed. Maya collapsed into his arms. Her clothes were violently torn. Her face was covered in dark bruises, and her beautiful eyes were completely empty and hollow. She was shaking uncontrollably, trapped in a state of severe clinical shock. Arthur did not ask questions immediately. He carried his granddaughter to the couch, wrapped her in thick, warm blankets, and carefully cleaned the mud and blood from her face. His heart felt like it was being squeezed by an iron vice. The raw, primal fury that ignited in Arthur's soul was utterly terrifying. It was a dark, ancient anger. When Maya finally found the strength to speak, she sobbed against his chest and told him every horrible detail. She told him about the black SUV, she told him about the cruel laughter, and most importantly, she told him the name Bradley Sterling, the untouchable son of the district attorney. She begged Arthur not to call the police, absolutely terrified of the powerful man's retaliation. Arthur held Maya until she finally cried herself into an exhausted sleep. Then he stood up. His face was entirely devoid of emotion. It was a mask of cold, calculated purpose. He walked quietly to his locked gun cabinet. He pulled out his trusted, deeply scratched, double-barrel shotgun. It was a heavy, reliable weapon. Arthur knew that going to the police would be completely useless. The corrupt DA would bury the evidence, destroy Maya's reputation in court, and let his monster of a son walk completely free. The law had failed them before it even began. So, Arthur decided to enforce the oldest law in the world. He went to his workbench. He carefully opened several shotgun shells, dumping out the lethal lead buckshot. He replaced the deadly pellets with coarse rock salt and sharp metal birdshot. He sealed the shells meticulously. He did not want to kill Bradley Sterling. Death was entirely too peaceful, too quick of an escape. Arthur wanted the boy to survive, but he wanted him to live in excruciating, permanent agony. He wanted Bradley to feel a fraction of the immense pain and fear he had inflicted upon innocent Maya. Arthur loaded the heavy weapon, put on his dark hunting jacket, and walked out into the cold night. Arthur drove his battered old truck down the mountain and straight into the wealthy, manicured suburbs of the city. He knew exactly where boys like Bradley spent their Friday nights. He parked in the dark shadows across the street from an exclusive, brightly lit country club. He sat perfectly still in the freezing cab of his truck, his eyes fixed intensely on the heavy oak doors of the club. He waited with the absolute patience of a seasoned hunter tracking a dangerous predator. Hours ticked by slowly. Finally, slightly after 2 in the morning, the heavy doors swung open. Bradley Sterling and his 2 friends stumbled out into the cool air. They were loudly laughing, entirely drunk, and completely devoid of any guilt. They looked like young kings of the world, untouched by the immense suffering they had caused. Arthur stepped quietly out of his truck. He racked the heavy action of the shotgun. The sharp, mechanical clack of metal echoed loudly in the quiet, wealthy street. He walked deliberately out of the shadows, the streetlights illuminating his furious, determined face. The boys stopped laughing immediately. They stared at the old man, their drunken confidence instantly evaporating into pure, unadulterated terror. Arthur raised the heavy double-barrel shotgun to his shoulder. His hands did not shake even a millimeter. He called out Bradley's name. His voice was incredibly deep, carrying the terrifying weight of absolute judgment. Bradley's face turned completely white. He raised his hands defensively, stammering incredibly pathetic, cowardly apologies. He suddenly realized that his father's vast wealth and political power meant absolutely nothing in the face of an angry grandfather holding a loaded weapon. Arthur did not hesitate. He pulled the first trigger. The shotgun roared like thunder, shattering the quiet night. The blast of rock salt and birdshot hit Bradley and the boy next to him squarely in the lower body. They screamed in absolute horrific agony, collapsing onto the pristine concrete. The third boy tried to run. Arthur calmly adjusted his aim and pulled the second trigger. The final blast caught the fleeing boy in the back of the legs, dropping him instantly to the ground. The three rapists writhed on the pavement, screaming for help, completely terrified and in immense, burning pain. Arthur stood over them for a long moment. He lowered the smoking weapon. He did not run. He simply walked over to the curb, sat down heavily, and waited patiently for the inevitable police sirens. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers quickly completely illuminated the street. Officers jumped from their vehicles, their weapons drawn, shouting incredibly tense commands. Arthur slowly placed the shotgun on the ground and raised his empty, calloused hands. He allowed them to push him roughly against the hood of a police car and lock heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. He felt absolutely no regret. The arrest process was a blur of bright lights, shouting officers, and cold holding cells. The trial that followed weeks later was a complete mockery of actual justice. District Attorney Richard Sterling personally oversaw the rapid prosecution. Sterling used every ounce of his massive political influence to prevent any mention of Myers' terrible assault from entering the official court record. He painted Arthur as a completely deranged, violent old man who attacked innocent college students unprovoked. Arthur refused to hire a lawyer to defend himself. He remained completely silent throughout the heavily biased proceedings. He accepted the guilty verdict with a stoic, unflinching gaze. The judge, clearly in the DA's pocket, sentenced the 70-year-old man to 5 brutal years in the worst maximum security penitentiary in the entire state. Before they transferred Arthur to the prison, the district attorney demanded a private meeting in the cold holding cells. Richard Sterling stood outside the heavy iron bars, wearing an incredibly expensive tailored suit. His face was twisted into a mask of pure, vindictive hatred. Sterling leaned close to the bars and whispered his terrible threat. He promised Arthur that he would use his vast connections to ensure the old man suffered every single day. Sterling declared that he had already paid off the worst gang leaders inside the penitentiary. He promised that Arthur would be humiliated, beaten, and completely broken before the end of his first month. Sterling spat on the floor and told Arthur to simply hang himself in his cell to save everyone the trouble. Arthur listened completely silently to the arrogant man's venomous speech. When Sterling finally finished, Arthur stepped right up to the iron bars. He looked the powerful district attorney directly in the eye and offered a terrifyingly calm smile. He whispered softly that Sterling's monster of a son would walk with a painful limp for the rest of his pathetic life. Arthur turned his back and walked to the small metal bench, leaving the furious prosecutor shaking with impotent rage. Now, lying in his prison bunk, Arthur brought his mind completely back to the harsh present. The weeks in the maximum security cell slowly bled into heavy, monotonous months. Despite the district attorney's vicious attempts to have him destroyed, Arthur survived. He survived because he had earned the deep, unwavering respect of the men in the cell. Even Jackson, the incredibly dangerous gang leader, kept his distance, unwilling to risk a full-scale riot by attacking the old ranger. During these long, difficult days, Arthur formed a strong, beautiful bond with the young mechanic, Leo. They spent their incredibly short yard time walking the concrete perimeter together. Arthur shared his deep wisdom about patience and survival, while Leo shared his extra food rations. They became a surrogate family behind the thick walls. Leo confessed the true reason he was locked inside this terrible place. The young man's story broke Arthur's heart and cemented their powerful bond forever. It was a story that perfectly mirrored Arthur's own tragic experience with the corrupt, wealthy elites who manipulate the American justice system without consequence. Leo explained his tragic past in a hushed, painful whisper. Before coming to prison, Leo had worked as a private driver for a massively wealthy real estate developer. The pay was incredibly good, and Leo needed the money to survive. One dark, rainy night, the developer's incredibly spoiled, heavily intoxicated son demanded to drive the expensive sports car himself. Leo tried desperately to stop him, but the arrogant boy refused to listen. Speeding recklessly through the slick city streets, the drunk boy completely lost control and violently struck a pedestrian in a busy crosswalk. The victim died instantly on impact. The boy panicked and fled the horrible scene. The next morning, the powerful developer cornered Leo. He offered the young, desperate driver an incredibly large sum of cash and guaranteed legal protection if Leo simply took the blame. The developer promised Leo would only serve a few short months. Being incredibly naive and desperately poor, Leo agreed to the terrible deal. But the moment the heavy courtroom doors slammed shut, the developer completely vanished. The money never arrived, the expensive lawyers disappeared, and Leo was abandoned to serve a massive, incredibly harsh sentence among hardened, violent criminals. Hearing Leo's incredibly painful story, Arthur felt a massive surge of fatherly affection for the young man. He decided to help Leo find a reason to keep living. Arthur began encouraging Leo to write letters. He asked the young man to write to Maya, knowing that his traumatized granddaughter desperately needed a completely safe, gentle connection to the outside world. At first, Leo was incredibly hesitant, completely ashamed of his terrible situation, but Arthur insisted strongly. The first letters were incredibly short and awkward, but soon the letters became incredibly long and deeply emotional. Maya wrote beautifully about the quiet mountain mornings, the tall pine trees, and her continuing nursing studies. Leo wrote incredibly passionately about his deep regrets, his dreams of opening a small repair shop, and his profound respect for Arthur. Through the slow, deliberate exchange of paper and ink, two completely broken young people began to deeply heal each other. They fell intensely in love through their words, completely separated by massive concrete walls and incredibly thick iron bars. Arthur watched Leo read Maya's letters with a massive, joyful smile, finding true peace in the dark cell. But the corrupt district attorney had absolutely not forgotten his vicious promise. The dark money Sterling had paid to the prison gangs finally trickled down directly to Jackson Cole. The heavily tattooed cell boss was ordered to completely eliminate the old ranger. One incredibly tense, quiet morning, right before the heavy cell doors opened for breakfast, Jackson made his incredibly violent move. He reached slowly under his dirty mattress and pulled out a long, incredibly sharp metal shank crafted from a stolen bed frame. He hid the deadly weapon carefully against his forearm. Arthur was standing completely still near the sink, washing his incredibly tired face with cold water, completely unaware of the massive danger closing in rapidly from behind. Jackson lunged forward with terrifying, explosive speed, aiming the sharp metal spike directly at the old man's exposed back. The entire cell completely froze in absolute terror. No one dared to scream or intervene against the incredibly violent gang leader. It seemed entirely certain that Arthur's long, difficult life was about to end in a massive pool of blood on the cold concrete floor. In a fraction of a second, Leo saw the deadly flash of raw metal. The brave young man did not hesitate or think about his own safety. He threw his entire body violently across the narrow space, completely placing himself between the terrifying blade and the old ranger. The sickening, incredibly loud sound of the sharp shank violently tearing through flesh echoed loudly through the completely silent cell. Leo gasped in massive, horrible agony as the sharp weapon buried itself incredibly deep into his side. He collapsed heavily onto the cold, hard floor, bright red blood instantly pooling widely around his shaking body. The sudden, extreme violence finally broke the paralyzing shock of the other inmates. Several large men aggressively tackled Jackson to the ground, viciously disarming him and pinning him heavily against the concrete wall. Arthur dropped to his shaking knees, his massive hands desperately applying intense pressure to Leo's terrible, bleeding wound. Arthur screamed with an incredibly raw, completely shattered voice, demanding the guards open the massive doors immediately. The terrifying alarm klaxons began to wail incredibly loudly, shaking the entire prison with their deafening, urgent noise. Heavily armed guards flooded rapidly into the chaotic cell. They dragged the violently cursing Jackson away, throwing him directly into the deepest, darkest solitary confinement hole in the penitentiary. Emergency medical staff rushed in rapidly, throwing Leo onto a hard stretcher and sprinting urgently toward the prison hospital. For several incredibly long, agonizing weeks, Arthur paced his tiny cell constantly, praying desperately for the young man's survival. Miraculously, Leo's incredible youth and intense physical strength pulled him completely through the terrible trauma. He survived the horrific assassination attempt. The profound sacrifice cemented an incredibly unbreakable bond between the two men. Time finally began to move rapidly. Because of their incredibly perfect behavior and the massive overcrowding of the prison, both Arthur and Leo were eventually granted early parole. They walked out of the massive iron gates on a brilliant, sunny spring morning. Standing excitedly by a reliable old truck was Maya, tears of massive joy streaming rapidly down her beautiful face. She completely threw her arms around Arthur and then turned to deeply embrace Leo, the incredible man she already completely loved. The universe has an incredibly strange way of completely balancing the massive scales of true justice. Shortly before Arthur and Leo were finally released, the arrogant Bradley Sterling completely lost control of his incredibly expensive sports car during a massive, alcohol-fueled rage. He crashed violently into a massive oak tree, completely ending his miserable life and entirely destroying his corrupt father's powerful political career. Today, Arthur, Leo, and Maya live incredibly peacefully together in the beautiful, quiet cabin deep in the vibrant Blue Ridge Mountains. Leo runs a massive, highly successful local garage, and Maya works as an incredibly respected, dedicated rural nurse. They are expecting their very first child, ensuring the tiny mountain cabin will soon be completely filled with massive, joyful laughter once again. Thank you incredibly much for watching this powerful story of absolute survival and true justice. If you felt the incredible emotion in this tale, please completely hit that like button, subscribe incredibly fast for more massive, emotional cinematic stories, and leave a detailed comment below. Do you truly believe that absolute karma always eventually punishes the deeply wicked? Let us completely know your massive thoughts.